You're listening to the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Lawyer is your legal bridge between Bitcoin and freedom. Today, I'm joined by Dan Parkinson. Dan is the founder of the Bitcoin IFA. Dan has more than 15 years in advertising and came to Bitcoin recently within the last 5 years and is a certified accountant. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. What an introduction.
So again, please correct me if any of the terminology that I used is not correct, but we'll get into titles and the exacts because there's a few acronyms I think that maybe some of the listeners might not be familiar with. So we'll just have to spell out everything. But Dan has been in Bitcoin for 5 years now and is launching a product called the Bitcoin IFA, which is a financial advisory product for, I believe, wealth managers. Maybe you can speak a little better to that, Dan.
Sure, no problem. So IFA is a term that I think is quite specific to the UK. So it stands for Independent Financial Advisor. And the reason we have to quantify or qualify that is because we have what's called tied and restricted advisors as well. So a tied advisor would be someone that works for a bank and just recommends the bank's products. A restricted advisor, we have some quite large networks in the UK. So St. James's Place, Quilter, for example, others are available. And they are restricted because they typically will only sell their own products. So they're restricted to their own network's products. Whereas an IFA, an independent financial advisor, they should be looking at whole of market. So I have launched the Bitcoin IFA to educate and inform and train IFAs, really. It is open to all financial advisors, but you can see that there's a bit of a conflict there with the tied and the restricted in that unless the company that they're tied to or restricted by offers some kind of Bitcoin exposure, they're never going to be able to get Bitcoin exposure for their clients. So realistically, it's IFAs, independent financial advisors, who have a fiduciary duty to be aware and analyze whole of market, including products or assets or technologies like Bitcoin. So I have launched the Bitcoin IFA, as I say, to educate and inform because A, I noticed that there was a niche. B, the Venn diagram of qualified financial advisors and Bitcoiners or Bitcoin maximalists is probably about 5 people in the UK, of which I am one. So I'm probably one of the most qualified people to talk about this in the UK. And yeah, it was time. The UK is seriously lagging behind other areas of the world, the US specifically, when it comes to Bitcoin adoption, Bitcoin education, Bitcoin information, etc.
Yeah, I definitely know that with the approval, or I guess, shall we say, restrictions imposed by the FCA, that it's kind of gone back and forth. Bitcoin investments were permissible for a while, then they weren't. And I guess they're coming back around on the issue. Maybe you can clarify that because I'm not entirely that well versed at all about the intricacies of what, and explain to people what the FCA is in the UK as well, if you could.
Sure. So the FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority. I believe that they are the UK equivalent of the SEC in the US. You might be able to correct me on that. So they essentially impose rules, regulations, legislation, etc. when it comes to all things finance. So you're absolutely correct in that some crypto instruments were available until I believe it was 2021. Up to that point, what are called ETNs, so exchange traded notes, were available. And an exchange traded note is a bit different from an exchange traded fund or ETF. So an exchange traded note, do you think it would be interesting for the listeners to explain the difference there?
Absolutely, because it's something that we're going to talk about. So, I think it's best to at least define what we're talking about, and then we can kind of dig into the details.
Perfect. Let's jump straight in. So an exchange traded note is a debt instrument. So my understanding is when you buy into an ETN, the ETN provider essentially owes you the price of the asset. So for example, let's say you buy £10,000 worth of a Bitcoin ETN and the price doubles. So the price of Bitcoin doubles. So in theory, the ETN provider now owes you £20,000. But at no point have you owned any share in the ETN provider. At no point have you owned the underlying asset. And also at no point is there a legal requirement for the ETN provider to own or custodian the underlying asset. Now, so whereas with an ETF, you buy a share in the fund in the same way that if you buy a share of Apple stock, you own a share of Apple. So when you buy an ETF, you own a share of the actual fund. And with an ETF, the ETF provider has to legally buy the underlying asset. Now, that being said, my understanding is that all of the ETNs that have been set up in Europe have all opted to buy the underlying asset. I don't know if they've opted or been co-opted. They've had to, but they do own the underlying asset. So, and the reason we have that distinction is because of what's called UCITS rules. So UCITS, I do not know what that stands for, but it's a European-wide legislation. And within UCITS rules, you are allowed a single product ETN. So you can just have a Bitcoin ETN.
Got it.
But you can't, under UCITS rules, have a single product ETF. So that fund has to be essentially a fund of products or a portfolio of products or a fund of funds, but an ETN can have a single asset within it. So ETNs were allowed until 2021. Then the FCA decided to ban them. So they banned all crypto ETNs. If you held crypto ETNs within your tax wrappers, you were allowed to keep them. But if you sold them, you weren't allowed to buy back. So most people who still own Bitcoin ETNs within their SIPs. So a SIP is a self-invested personal pension, which I think, so a pension is our equivalent of like your 401ks. Is that right?
For me, a pension is just any type of annuity that you receive as a retirement. But anyways, I'm not a financial advisor, so I don't want to really get dragged through the mud and have people in the comments say, hey, no, it's actually this. Okay, we might be mixing words here. Everyone listening has a general idea of what a pension is. So anyways, please continue.
So we were able to hold within our tax wrappers an ETN. So an ISA is an individual savings account. It's basically a savings account that grows free from capital gains, as is a SIP. It's your pension. It grows free from capital gains until you can access it at 55, something like that. Those who have held ETNs in Bitcoin since pre-ban, since 2021, have obviously done very well. And the FCA has just proposed to lift the ban. So they have put forward a proposal to say, we're thinking about lifting the ban. And then they've asked for a consultation. So they've asked everyone, obviously really targeting financial services workers. They've asked them to give their feedback. Now, my understanding is, because my experience with the FCA is fairly limited, but those who have extensive experience with the FCA have told me that when the FCA puts forward a proposal like this and asks for a consultation, it's actually because they've already made up their mind.
I see. Okay.
So in all likelihood, the ban on ETNs is going to be lifted in Q3 this year, maybe early Q4, something like that.
I see. So presumably, are they opening it up for public comments? Because I'm just trying to draw some sort of parallel. I spent more than a decade working for the US government as a civil servant. So normally when there's within the US government, they call it like a rules change where they're just changing a regulation, the way that the law is interpreted. They normally open it up for 60 days of public commentary. There's something called the Federal Register, which basically encompasses everything that the government does, and people can provide comments, feedback, their thoughts on any proposed rule changes, things like that. Is that what the FCA is opening, or are they doing it more as a formality just because it's required?
Great question. I'm not sure if it's required. I don't know if they have to do it.
Okay.
But what they have done is exactly what you've just described. So it's roughly 60 days, I think, or maybe 6 weeks, something like that, of public feedback. But obviously, Joe Bloggs on the street has got no idea. So it's really only financial services employees that are going to feed back on this.
Gotcha.
And then all that's going to happen with this, more than likely. So I know that there are some big players within the Bitcoin community in the UK that have given their feedback, which is that the lift on the ban doesn't go far enough. So if what they're proposing is that, I mean, it's called, everything in the UK has to be called crypto because there is no distinction between crypto and Bitcoin. But realistically, if Bitcoin is okay, then make it okay, right? So allow retail to access ETFs, allow retail to hold spot on-chain Bitcoin within their tax wrappers. But it's more than likely that those aren't going to happen. All this is going to be is the FCA are lifting a ban that the FCA imposed. So if they wanted wholesale changes to allow on-chain Bitcoin, spot Bitcoin within tax wrappers, or to allow ETFs, for example, that would require quite large regulation and legislatory changes, and those would probably have to go through Parliament. So this is a great first step, but it's literally the FCA just lifting their own self-imposed ban.
I see. It definitely sounds like it's a step in the right direction, but probably would take an act of Parliament to probably further appease what Bitcoiners are really going after. So that's interesting, and I really appreciate you explaining it for listeners and myself. I mean, my best friend lives in North London and been going to the UK on and off since 2001. Actually used to live up near Ipswich for a few years when I was in the Air Force stationed there at an RAF base. So quite familiar with a lot of things there, but not on the financial side. So if we could maybe just pivot from talking about the Bitcoin IFA, and maybe you could talk about your personal venture from Bitcoin. And I know from our conversation offline, I was asking you about your Bitcoin journey, and you said you found Bitcoin before getting into TradFi, but it's normally the reverse. People come from TradFi and then discover Bitcoin. So maybe you could walk the listeners through a little bit of your journey of discovering Bitcoin.
Sure, it would be a pleasure. You are absolutely correct in that most people do a 1 or 2 decade journey in TradFi, then they find Bitcoin. It's a total paradigm shift, and it changes everything for them. I found Bitcoin during lockdowns in a hotel room in Lebanon in December 2020, something like that. And we can touch on how I got there.
Sure, absolutely.
But yeah, so I went into Bitcoin, went down the rabbit hole, spent 2 or 3 months pretty much locked up in a hotel room. I was allowed out for a few hours a day. So I had a lot of time, a lot of curiosity. As a consequence of landing in Lebanon, that curiosity changed that mindset. I had first encountered Bitcoin in 2020, 2015, 2017 during the bull run, 2018. My mum went to a lecture at the LSE, the London School of Economics, came back raving about it. And then in 2019, I invested in a friend's startup. I actually leveraged my house. I remortgaged my house to invest in the startup, which is quite naughty, totally against TradFi rules. And he was actually saying to me, you should invest some of this money in Bitcoin. So like he was actively, pushing me away from investing so much in his own company to say you should invest in Bitcoin. And throughout that, whatever that was, 6-7 year journey of encountering Bitcoin, I just dismissed it out of hand, no research. But I just thought this is too disruptive. Governments will never allow this without having done even a minute's research. And so when I landed in Lebanon, and Lebanon was experiencing hyperinflation, so their currency had already collapsed from 1,500 lira to the dollar to 5,000 lira to the dollar. So it already lost like 70% of its value by the time I arrived.
I see.
And I was going to be there for 6 months initially. So I'd taken a few $1,000s with me in dollars. And I wanted to exchange. And I was told you have to exchange on the black market, right? If you go to an official bank or an exchange, you're going to get 1,500. Don't do that. So then we sort of set up this drug deal, essentially, is how it felt. Like you had to text a guy on WhatsApp and then he would come by on a moped and you exchanged envelopes. It was black market exchanges, essentially. And so I just thought, I don't really want to be doing this fairly regularly. So I'm just going to exchange $1,000. And everyone in the hotel I was staying at and all the Lebanese, everyone was like, do not trade $1,000 for, at that point, 5 million lira. It's a terrible trade. And
Okay.
I was being stubborn, British, close-minded. I was like, no. Like, I don't want to do this all the time. I'm doing it once. So I traded $1,000 for 5 million lira. 3 days later, the exchange rate had fallen from 5,000 to the dollar to 8,000 to the dollar. So that 5 million lira, which bought $1,000 worth of stuff, 3 days later bought $600 worth of stuff, or whatever that exchange rate was. And I was like, this is bonkers. Like, this is the first time I've ever experienced hyperinflation like this. What is going on? So that led me to being very open then, because I started listening to podcasts in Lebanon and they were talking about Bitcoin. People in Lebanon were talking about Bitcoin. And so I reached out to the friends that had tried to orange pill me over the last 6 years. And they were like, yeah, like start doing some research. And then, it's December 2020. So I was like, oh, I should buy some. Like I should buy some right now. And I continued to buy for the next 3 or 4 months. Yeah. So that was really my entry point into Bitcoin. And, from there, it's just been deeper and deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. Then around 2023 is when I was still in Lebanon. I ended up staying in Lebanon for 3 years. Beautiful country, amazing people. We'll touch on that in a second. So I was just living off savings. I made an absolute mess of my first cycle. I lost a load of money. If I'd have just held,
Yeah. I mean,
I would never have to work again.
I mean, there's so many stories of that. I'm just going to go on a little side story, and I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, not personally, but there's this guy that I remember. He's been in the British press for probably a decade. The guy whose girlfriend threw away his hard drive. Yeah. Okay. For all the listeners, Dan is actually nodding right now. But maybe you know more of the details. I don't remember how many Bitcoin, but this guy basically had his Bitcoin saved on a hard drive. His girlfriend threw out the hard drive. It went to the local landfill. And basically, for years, he's been trying to get the local council to approve him to go in and actually excavate the landfill. And they've told him flat out, no, I believe it's gone. I don't know if it's gone to the High Court in the UK, but it's at least gone to some level of court. And I think there was a decision within the last month where they told him no. And the guy's offered like a 10% bounty if anyone can find it. And I think he's even had outside financiers come in and offer to just kind of, bankroll the excavation search. Dan, I don't know. Do you know any more of the specific details of the case?
Yeah, I do. So he had about 8,000 Bitcoin on a hard drive. Yeah, so I think that's billionaire, I think. So you're absolutely correct. His now ex-girlfriend threw the hard drive away.
After that much.
And he has repeatedly offered to split share with the council. So I believe he's offered them 50%. Now,
Wow.
Most councils, and Newport Council, where I think it's based, I'm fairly certain it's Newport in Wales. Most councils in the UK are broke, like absolutely broke. So for those that don't know, councils are smaller catchment areas within. So we have counties, which are kind of similar to the US's states. And then within that, we have councils, which are sort of, there's like 10 council areas, catchment areas within each county, right? So they're relatively small areas, but they take care of things like street lighting, bins, so trash.
TV license enforcement.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's national, but yeah, something like that. And then but one of the main things they also have to take care of is like senior citizens care. So the vast majority, and we have to pay a council tax. So every household has to pay a council tax, and that goes towards your bins being emptied, your street lighting, blah, blah, blah. But the vast majority of council tax now is being paid out for it's the equivalent of sort of social security, looking after senior citizens who are in care. And I mean the vast majority. It's like, in well over 50%, 50 to 70% range, right? So they're broke, right? And they're only going to continue getting more broke because we have an aging population.
That's every Western country with declining numbers. But anyways, yeah, I'm sorry.
Exactly. But so you would think that Newport Council would be like, okay, wait, you're going to share $4 billion with us if we help you to find this thing. But they have flat out refused at every point. And he has offered to find it himself. So he'll pay to find it. He will then pay to cover up the damage, because obviously you're digging up a landfill, you're digging up a dump essentially, which in theory, it could be harmful to the environment, blah, 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 right? So he's offered to pay to find it, pay to take care of the damage once it's found, and then split what remains 50% with the council. And they have flat out refused. And you're right, I don't know how high up it went in terms of the judiciary, but he did get essentially a final settlement, which was no, fairly recently. So what he's now doing, I believe, is he is raising outside capital to go and buy the land. He's just going to buy the land from the council. So he's like, I now own it. I can do whatever I want with it. He's had people reach out to him who have designed tech. So someone has reached out to him with a drone. So without having to actually dig it up, this person would be able to fly a drone over the site, which I guess uses some kind of LiDAR or something like that, to be able to identify small pieces of electronics within the dump deep down. So instead of having to go and dig, so they know roughly where this thing is. So like, let's say I'm making up these numbers, but let's say it's like a 10-acre site. They know that it's within a 1-acre space. But this person has developed a drone that would be able to say, instead of having to dig up a whole acre, we've got to dig up a 3-yard square space, and that's it.
Yeah, if they can actually identify it. While you were talking, I actually ran the numbers. So 8,000 Bitcoin is equivalent to 8.55 billion USD. What is that? Let's call it 6 billion pounds, something like that.
There isn't a council in the land that wouldn't feel that, as a positive upside, getting 3 billion pounds. Like, everyone is baffled as to why the council are not allowing this. And obviously it's leading to all kinds of conspiracy theories, like, where are the bodies buried, or, that kind of stuff. Because it's like, what are you afraid of being dug up?
I don't know what they would be afraid of digging up in Wales, other than just people, who have disposed of their sheep carcasses. If you know what I'm getting at. We don't need to clue the listeners in, but if anyone knows anything about Wales, you'll know what I'm implying. So anyways, all right.
You know.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yeah, well, yeah, that's interesting. So, okay, I'm sorry. Let's come back. You were talking about Lebanon and 2023.
So I made a bit of a hash. In theory, if I was careful, I would never have to work again if I had made a good go of my first cycle. So I realized that I was going to have to come back and work, and I looked at, I could go back into advertising, but I deeply hated it. I resented the idea of that. I looked at the assets that I had, which was, a very deep knowledge of Bitcoin, a newfound interest in TradFi and general finance. How do bond prices affect how do bond prices affect interest rates? How do interest rates affect risk assets, et cetera, et cetera. So I decided to retrain as a financial advisor, and so retraining is relatively easy. Getting into the profession is actually very difficult. So once I had retrained, there wasn't a financial advice firm in the country. I pretty much applied to dozens, maybe hundreds, to IFA firms, so independent firms. And none of them wanted to factor in that I had built an incredibly successful advertising career in client services. So you are getting an inexperienced advisor, but a very experienced customer service manager, someone that knows how to deal with people. So no one wanted to take that risk, essentially. So I had to go down the route of, initially, actually, I was told that I could practice being a financial advisor from Lebanon. That was incorrect. So I had to come back to the UK, and then I ended up having to join one of the larger networks, and I had to go through their academy program. So that would have been last summer. So like June, July 2024. And I had two prerequisites going in, which were I want to be able to use cash flow modeling tools. There's a very good one, Voyant. Others are available, but I wanted to be able to use tools like Voyant to actually plan my clients' cash flow essentially for the rest of their life. And I wanted to be able to put people, where relevant, into 100% global equities, because coming from the Bitcoin world, we know that the real hurdle rate is 10 to 12%. If you're not returning 10 to 12% on your assets, and if you're not getting a 10 to 12% pay rise every year, then I'm sorry, you are falling behind in terms of purchasing power.
Okay, so you're just talking about pacing inflation, correct?
Yeah, right. So not creating wealth, just literally protecting your purchasing power. And that's what global equities do. They return about 11% a year. So it's literally where we print the money that finds its way into risk assets like global equities. And they go up on an almost one-to-one correlation, and have done since 2008, since the paradigm shift of 2008. So I was told going in, no problem. This is your business. So like you're setting up under a network, but it's your business essentially. So you can put people into global equities, you can use cash flow modeling, no problem. So I was told that by the recruiter. Day 2 of the academy, they told us you are not allowed to use an outside cash flow modeling. So you can't use Voyant, and they don't have their own cash flow modeling tool. And I was like, well, this is just nonsense then. So now we're just guessing. So that was strike one. And then the academy was about 6 weeks. So and realistically, all the academy was training you to sell their products. It had this facade and the total pretense of being client centric, and it just wasn't. It was nonsense. So then a couple of months after graduating, so they gave you leads. That was one of the reasons I went with them. They give you leads. So I'm like working through the leads that they gave me, and I'm doing pretty well. But then I got my first family or friends test. So I had a friend reach out and he wanted to work with me. And he was 40. He had worked for 20 years in a job that he hated, and he built up a pension, which wasn't too bad. He had a pension of like 120, 130 grand, 20 years until he can access it. And I was like, that's pretty good for someone that age. It's way ahead of the mean. It's probably, a whole standard deviation above the average. I think the average pension pot in the UK when someone actually retires is less than 100 grand. So he was doing really well. But he hated his job so much. His children were grown, or his sole child was grown. So he'd left his job, and he set up a new job that was really good for his mental health, which is a dog walker. So he was walking other people's dogs all day on the hills in the greenery, and he was like, I'm happy. This is it. And I was like, okay. So then what we need to do is maximize your pension pot by the time you retire, right? Because you're not really making any money now. You're not going to be able to contribute to it. So let's just put you in global equities, get you 11% a year. And then, he's got whatever that mass is. It was like 500,000, something like that, retirement. Like let's do that. But in order to do that within this network, I had to get a concession. Okay. And it wasn't even 100% global equities. The max you could put someone in was a 60-40 portfolio. It's insane. That was their highest level of risk.
Isn't that just because that's sort of the normal distribution? I mean, that's sort of the classic model.
But the 60-40 is the classic model, the average. That's supposed to be the mean. That's supposed to be, risk level 3 out of 5. Their risk level 5 out of 5 was a 60-40 portfolio. It was an incredibly risk and volatility averse company. I kind of knew that going in, but not really. Like I was, sort of missold, misrepresented. And so, but what they did have was an 80-20 portfolio, but you had to get a concession.
Is that difficult to obtain?
So I applied for it. It was my first one. I'd never done it. So I applied for this concession. It gave my reasoning, and it was declined. And the reason it was declined was because his pension was the only asset he had. So he didn't earn that well, didn't really have much savings. And so the way they saw it was, we need to protect this 120 grand because he's going to need it to retire on. Whereas I was thinking, we need to maximize this 120 grand because this is what he's going to retire on in 20 years. So we've got time to recover any 50% drawdowns in the stock market, but we need to maximize his exposure to risk assets because those are the greatest returns. So, and I went back and forth. I argued till I was blue in the face with them, and they just said, no, they just shut it down. And I was like, well, that's strike two.
If I can just ask a quick question, do you find that normally financial or I guess regulatory bodies in the UK are more conservative than other places in Europe or the US? Like that's the impression that I've always gotten, that the UK is very just way too conservative. And it seems like a lot of companies actually, I think this happened recently. The company Wise, the currency transfer company, used to be TransferWise. They left the FTSE and actually listed on the NASDAQ in the US just because they weren't, I think it had to do with not being able to access enough capital for expansion. But I was just curious, is that sort of epidemic within the UK financial markets? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So there's two different things there. So there's one which is access to capital, and then the other one which is a general conservatism when it comes to investing. So I would say the conservatism is endemic, but really we're talking about retail investors there. And then the lack of capital is just a 20-year decline of growth and over-regulation. Let's touch on that one first. We are strangled by regulation. The amount of red tape and the regulation has left a lot of advisors and a lot of firms being very risk averse because they are, instead of focusing on being client centric and client outcomes, they are focused on making sure they don't get in trouble with the regulator. And so when I was doing plans, and actually this leads back quite well into that specific example I was talking to you about, which is the compliance team within the network that I worked for were more concerned with not getting in trouble with the FCA than they were with this specific client's outcome. So rather than let's maximize this person's return in retirement, they would rather say, let's protect this client from any potential drawdown. And that is endemic as well. So it's, that is led by the FCA, led by the regulatory environment, and we are over-regulated. There is way too much red tape. And just to complete a single person's plan. So you would go and have the initial meeting, right, to what's called a fact find with the client. Then you would have to come back and you would have to prepare for their presentation meeting, which is where you would go through, look, this is what we're going to do for you. This is your plan. And between those two meetings, I would say, initially it was probably 40 to 60 hours work, but I got it down to, I don't know, maybe 20, 25. And it was all of the regulatory hoops that you had to go through. Also, it didn't help that the network that I worked for, the way I described it was I was working with Century funds, right? Because the 60-40 portfolio worked right up until 2008, right up until it didn't. So I was working with Century funds on last millennium tech. It didn't help that their CRM and tech tools were terrible. But that was also, so that was one of the other reasons that I left. We'll come on to, I left. Actually, we can touch on that now. So, I ended up leaving. I didn't last very long. I worked in the TradFi world for about 6 months because I was just like, you don't have cash flow modeling, which is at this point is at least a decade old in the profession, at least, probably more like 15 years. So you don't have 15-year-old tech that your competitors are using. You won't allow me to put a client who is 40 into global equities, which is where we protect his purchasing power. And you're using 20-year-old tech to try and do this business, which meant even once I got highly skilled at this, it's still not scalable. Like it still takes me 20 hours per client to prepare their plan, which means realistically, I can only see 1 to 2 clients a week because you've also got presentation meetings. So I've probably, and then a bunch of work after that. So the max I can see is 1 to 2 clients per week, new clients. And the way you build the business is new clients. So I was like, it's going to take me 4 years to get to a reasonable amount of income here. And it's going to be 60 to 80 hours a week for 4 years. It's not scalable. And it's all because of the regulatory environment, the red tape. Basically, the regulation is put in place to try and create, so it's what's called positive outcomes for clients. What the regulators have tried to do is say, we can't control everything that you do, right? There's no point in trying to be incredibly descriptive about every single client. So what they've done is change it to, we want positive client outcomes. But if you think about it, positive client outcomes just means never having drawdowns.
Yeah, I mean, that also means never having a large upside either. Because if you never have, and I'm not talking like volatile swings, but if you never have, like you said, drawdowns of a significant amount, then you never have the upside when it rebounds and even goes past where it previously was to hit a new all-time high. So, I mean, I would just assume that that's really frustrating, especially from a financial advisor side, where you're trying to be innovative, you're trying to offer clients different options, and you just, even if you are the most innovative person and you come up with a new angle on the financial product, it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, but it just sounds like you're almost beat down by the system for trying to, get higher returns to also, in a capitalist society, increase your own earnings, that as well. So I could definitely understand how that's frustrating on both ends, where your clients might not have, you're not perhaps meeting their expectations, you're not able to be as aggressive as they would like, and you're not able to maximize profit on your end. So yeah, that I could definitely see.
Yeah, it was baffling to me because you're absolutely right. If your clients do well and you work on an AUM model, assets under management model, so you get paid more as the network and the individual advisor if the clients do well. And the most frustrating thing was when I was retraining to be a financial advisor, I found another podcast. It's called the TRAP podcast, TRAP, and it stands for the Real Advisor Podcast. Those guys are doing really sort of progressive, not exploratory, but very sort of new, but it's not even new. It's like a decade old financial advice now, which is global equities. So it's cash flow modeling. So it's cash flow modeling, but the investment thesis is pretty much the same for every client, which is it's global equities. And it doesn't matter if you're 40 or if you're 60 or if you're 70, because you've got a plan that they're going to live to 90 to 100. So even if you're 70, you've got 20 to 30 years to go. You need to maximize your returns, not minimize your risk. And so I was listening to this podcast for a year before I started at this network. And then I was just like, these guys are practicing this new paradigm of financial advice, which isn't even that new. It's a decade old. And I'm working for a firm that I stand by the way I described it, working with 20th century funds on last millennium tech. And I was just like, what am I doing here? I was sat with 55-year-olds. So 55 at the moment is the earliest age you can access your pension in the UK. And I was sat with 55-year-olds who had 50 grand in their pension, and they were having to access it now because they're broke. And I was just like, this 50 grand is supposed to last you till you are 100, and you're taking money out of it now because you're broke. You need Bitcoin. And I can't talk to you about Bitcoin because I'm literally breaking the law if I do. So sadly, my own self-preservation has to take priority over your financial needs.
I think that's actually a really good point to kind of pivot into some of the other questions I had. So, I mean, how would you say you've seen a shift with other IFAs and wealth managers, like their view on Bitcoin? Has it been sort of these backroom discussions, like when you get together with other financial managers and you guys just, kind of complain about, sort of woe is me, like, hey, like, we would love to offer this to our client, but we're unable to? Or what, has it been a hard sell to other financial advisors? Or is it just sort of, you mentioned you as one of 5 people in the UK qualified to talk about this. Wasn't sure if you meant it's a hard sell or if you're just sort of complaining group mentality, if that makes sense.
So what I was alluding to when I was saying this, there's probably only 5 regulated or qualified financial advisors who also have my level of knowledge about Bitcoin. And I've actually very recently, in the last couple of weeks, just started a WhatsApp channel for about 20 advisors. And actually, I will come back to your question about what it's been like trying to speak to advisors. So I've put these 20 chaps, they're all chaps, into this WhatsApp group. I would say that actually, so I made that figure of about 5. I just made that up like 6 months ago. I just assumed. But actually, there's probably There's about 15, 16 of us in the group. And I would say my knowledge is certainly in the top 5. Right. So, and what I have found is once I went live with the Bitcoin IFA, so once I put my head above the parapet and said, do you know what, financial advisors, you need to learn about Bitcoin. Immediately I found my tribe. So immediately I probably had, most of these 16 people that are in the WhatsApp group, most of them reached out to me immediately saying, I've been in Bitcoin for however long, X number of years. I've been a financial advisor for X number of years. I can't talk about it. I want to talk about it. I want to get my clients into it. How do I do that? Et cetera, et cetera. And then the rest have been a slow burn, right? So there's one IFA in the country who's very well known, and he's actually one of the presenters of the Trap podcast that I referenced earlier. I sent him Joe Bryan's What's the Problem? Side note, if anyone listening has not watched What's the Problem by Joe Bryan, go and watch that. And so I sent him that, and so I very nearly got a job with him before I joined the network. He was the only one that very nearly took a chance on me. And for various reasons, we decided it wasn't a good idea. But we'd stayed in contact, and I mentioned Bitcoin to him a couple of times, and he was dismissive. As if I use this phrase that everyone's against Bitcoin until they're for it. So it's a very binary thing, right? You're either for it or against it. It's very difficult to be in a gray area when it comes to Bitcoin. And so I sent him What's the Problem? And he came back like 2 days later and was like, oh my God, I get it. What do we do? So he's been really great. So he's been so positive in lifting me during dark times, but also just, promoting my new business. I genuinely get the feeling from both people in the Bitcoin community and people in the financial advice community who are into Bitcoin. They want me to succeed more than I do. And I really want me to succeed. So he's been really great. We are slowly converting some financial advisors. In fact, one of the guys in the WhatsApp group just this morning said, it's been really great being in here. And, bear in mind, this thing is 5 days old. So he was like, it's been amazing being in this group. I was part of the financial advice community that just said, this is unregulated. I can't talk about it. And it's eye-opening to him what we're sharing and talking about. So it's a slow burn. I'm not gonna lie and tell you that I'm making riches out of this business. It has been 4 or 5 months of really hard slog, posting on LinkedIn at least once a day, reaching out to financial advisors directly, getting a lot of no's, a lot of pushback from financial advisors in the comments on LinkedIn. I certainly would not have chosen this new venture if I was looking for positive reinforcement from my target market.
I'm right there with you because, I think I found your content originally on LinkedIn. That's how we kind of, came into contact and got to know each other. So, I'm right there with you in the trenches about posting every day, trying to be vigilant. And, it's a constant, like the word you used, slog, is perfect to describe just how you have to grind on that. And I mean, like, it's not just posting content, but, replying to other people and then trying to comment on other people's things to try to increase your engagement. And there's a whole science to it. I've had a few conversations with marketing people about it, and I was like, this is a lot deeper than I was aware of. And, but that's a whole other conversation. I definitely can appreciate what you're saying, trying to upstart a business. Bitcoin Lawyer just started in January of this year, and there are, in the citizenship residency by investment space, there are basically a few 800-pound gorillas in the room. And, it's basically, there's a few firms that aren't so much on social media, but they have the client contacts. They have the Rolodex to essentially have that privilege. And then there's the other ones that are at the forefront of social media and are just pumping out content and, different models, different results, but trying to kind of break into that scene or that industry as an independent. I'm not sure if it's the same in your case, is extremely difficult and definitely an uphill battle. So I can definitely, we have that in common.
Well, and you've been really proactive in commenting on my LinkedIn post. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it because it helps
Absolutely.
to spread the engagement, as you say. But yeah, I liken it. An analogy I would like to use is I'm trying to forge my way into the densest rainforest imaginable on my own using a blunt machete.
And no map, right?
No map. Yeah, no map and no idea where I'm going.
No map, no compass, your own wit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there are small wins. So I've just launched. I have some workshops. So I've built a workshop. As you and I know, and any listeners to this who are Bitcoiners know, unfortunately, it is very, very difficult to get the idea of Bitcoin across in an elevator pitch. It's been the best performing asset of the last 16 years. It's likely to be the best performing asset of the next 16 years. 0% allocation to it is essentially betting that the trend of Bitcoin outperforming equities and bonds is going to reverse. Side note, it's not, right? So that's your elevator pitch. But it's really difficult with financial advisors to get that across. What I've done is built a workshop that's 90 minutes long with 30 minutes Q&A. So that's if I'm actually there. And I've been very fortunate to have that signed off as 2 hours structured CPD.
It's continued professional development.
Yeah, exactly. So in the UK, financial advisors have to do 35 hours a year, 15 hours. They can just do what they want. So they can just say, I read the Financial Times. Well done.
Basically like free electives.
Yeah. And then 20 hours has to be structured. You have to get a certificate, say you've done it. You've got to go through what did you learn, blah, blah, blah. And usually it's put on by, Vanguard, Dimensional, BlackRock, blah, blah, blah. And typically it's free, right? So that's another challenge. But so I've had this thing signed off as 2 hours structured CPD. It's a workshop if I'm live because it includes a 30-minute Q&A at the end. And that's 10%. That's 10% of their annual structured CPD. So it's like, that's a great sell. I've been very, very lucky to get that. And I'm getting some buy-in. I've probably delivered half a dozen of these now or have them upcoming that are paid. I've sold a few dozen of webinars. I've also had them signed off to be delivered as an on-demand webinar. So that's just 90 minutes. There's no Q&A. Doesn't exist yet. It'll be pre-recorded and then delivered to them at a time that's convenient for them. And I'm getting some buy-in, right? So and it's slow. It's, the dominoes just need to fall one at a time. And the thing is, as you and I both know, this is a business, right? And the same way yours is a business. The question is just timing. It's not, is there going to be demand for our services? Yes. Is there enough demand right now? That's for you to determine, right? What are your living costs, blah, blah, blah. So I know that this business is really hard. It's an absolute grind, getting quite negative pushback. It is not for the faint-hearted, but I also know that if I can just stay in the game long enough, I win. Right? If I just earn enough over the next 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 months, I win. Because eventually people will be clamoring for this service rather than me having to do hard sell.
No, explain this. I remember, so this was a conversation I had just about 2 years ago. I was speaking to someone who, this Canadian guy who has a large citizenship by investment firm. He's actually based out of London, but worked for HSBC and then eventually started his own company. So I went to law school in Malta. They have an office in Malta because Malta, up until April, had the only EU citizenship by investment program, right? So he and I were talking, and I was trying to pitch the idea of accepting Bitcoin for payment services, for professional services. On this podcast, I've had Joseph Muscat, who's the former prime minister of Malta. And during the interview, he and I were talking about, this is when Malta actually, it was like a month before the ECJ judgment and Malta had to shut down their program. But, I was asking, why can't Malta accept Bitcoin or cryptocurrency for payment? I mean, would you guys be open to accepting perhaps like a euro denominated stablecoin? And, the pushback was, what about the ECB? What would the Germans say? That sort of thing. And you realize that in traditional finance, everyone is beholden to someone else. But this is the beauty of Bitcoin, that Bitcoin is beholden to no one, And I was at a conference the beginning of May, and I was speaking to a few of the heads so in the Caribbean, there's 5 countries that have citizenship by investment programs. 3 of the heads were there, and I spoke to each of them privately. And I was trying just to kind of get a gauge to see if their specific program would be open to accepting Bitcoin for payment. The interesting thing about those is that all of those countries are part of a currency block, which is the Eastern Caribbean dollar. Right. So that block there's actually 6 countries in that union, of that monetary union, but all the programs denominate their citizenship by investment in US dollars. So that then creates another issue where when they receive the funds, they actually have to go through US correspondent banks, which also then go through the US Treasury. And, this is why the US essentially has so much say over those programs, not just from a geopolitical, but because they control the entire financial infrastructure of the programs and how they receive their funds. So I was trying to make this pitch and I was like, well, what if you guys just accept Bitcoin? Then it doesn't matter. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Bitcoin, but I think you and I both could list 5,000 reasons why Bitcoin is the better alternative to accepting, say, a stable coin or some other crypto. Right. So I won't even try to make that sale because that's a whole other conversation. But, it's trying to make this pitch to people who are in their later 60s, have been in governmental positions for maybe 30 years, perhaps more. They're not really open to it. It's not that perhaps maybe this is akin to what you've encountered with financial advisors in the UK. It's not that they're not open to it. It's you need to give them a reason to change, right? So and trying to make that case is really the uphill battle, is the struggle. You're like, well, yes, your model is working, but it could be working so much better if you were to incorporate this other financial instrument. I was just curious to hear your thoughts on some of that.
I would actually go so far. So there's a couple of things you've touched on there. So the first one is pushback from advisors. So, some are interested, some aren't. So I think the way I sort of visualize this is I've probably found the 1%, 0.5 to 1% of financial advisors who are really into Bitcoin. They've already found me, I think, right? Hopefully there's more. Then I think you've probably got 10 to 20% who are open to it. So they're Bitcoin curious, but they've done no research. Then I think you've probably got 60% that are just apathetic, don't care, too busy with work, too busy with life, just want to do their job. Who cares about rocking a boat? Sadly, I would say, don't really care about client outcomes in terms of doing their fiduciary duty to find what are the best insurance. They're just like, this is the thing that's always worked. I'm just going to do my job. And then you've got probably 20%. I have no idea. I haven't kept track of the maths here, but then you've got about 20% that just are so anti it and are never going to be open to it. So that's how I kind of see things at the moment, right? And it's really everyone except that 20% that are anti it are going to fall in line at some point, right? They're going to have to learn about it because their competitors are recommending it, or or all of their clients get exposure to Bitcoin anyway because a bunch of treasury companies end up in the S&P, right? So Coinbase was admitted a couple of months ago. I'm seeing a lot of rumors about MicroStrategy or strategy literally in the next few days. So I think they're going through testing or something like that. I might be very wrong, but I've seen some stuff on Twitter about that strategy may be accepted onto the S&P shortly, presently. So, all of their clients are going to get exposure if they don't already. If they own any global equities, they've got some exposure to Tesla, Coinbase, Mercado Libre, et cetera, right? So they're going to have to learn about it at some point. It's just a question of when, right? And that's what I was alluding to about, can I stay in the game long enough until they have to come and buy my services, right? So, but then the other one you touched on.
I hit on the idea of basically not hyper Bitcoinization, but just the institutional adoption where like you start talking about like being beholden to certain government entities. And that's definitely an issue with a lot of these countries because some of them receive 30-40% of their GDP through these citizenship by investment programs. And what's ironic is all of them are former British colonies and were actually encouraged by the UK in the 70s and early 80s when they got their independence to become sort of these tax havens, to become these places where, okay, tourism, yes, but also offer financial services. And that's a way to generate income. And now all of a sudden, they're in the scope of the Fat F, the OECD, the US State Department recently released a list of 36 countries. They're talking about banning, basically giving them 60 days to sort of reconcile things. And 4 of the 5 Caribbean countries were on that list for the citizenship by investment programs. Yeah, sorry. I realize I'm going off on a tangent. What you were searching for was I was talking about being beholden to governmental entities, governmental bodies.
Yeah, so I've still forgotten what I was going to say. What do you think would happen to one of those countries in the Caribbean if they were to break away and say, do you know what? We're going the Bitcoin route.
So there would definitely be some political pushback. And the irony of this is that the US is sort of getting into this citizenship by investment game that Trump has proposed with the Trump Gold Card. Now, I'll try to give a quick high level overview because this is a conversation I've had with a lot of people. And again, I said I spent 12 years as a civil servant, but specifically working on immigration policy in the US. So this is something that I know quite well. The issue with the Trump Gold Card, so basically people who don't know, it's a program that Trump has proposed. There is zero legislation, zero bills going through Congress to actually allow this. But what has been proposed is 5 million US per person. They haven't said if it would be like per family, if dependents would be extra. They've basically just set a price point of 5 million, basically lets you come in and become a US citizen. They haven't said what the timeline is. The big issue with this is that under the INA, which is the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1986, which is where all U.S. immigration law currently comes from, the INA, there is no caveat. There is no immigrant category for this. Like what they're proposing, it does not exist per legislation. Like there is no category that they're specifically talking about. And this is not something that can be done by executive order. The Congress needs to amend the legislation to create that category so that they could then begin to issue visas under that. The second part is that the US is we could get into sort of splitting hairs, but US citizens and US persons, including permanent residents, are taxed on their global income, whether or not they live in the US. In your case, in the UK, you guys have no exit tax. So if you decide next day that you want to go back to Lebanon or you want to go move to British Virgin Islands like Richard Branson did, I think he bought Necker Island when he was like 27, 28. And BVI, no personal income tax. That's how you become a billionaire, right? Still get to keep the British passport. You don't have to file any taxes or pay them. Great system. But for US, they're talking about with this Trump card that the people coming in would not be subject to worldwide taxes. So you essentially have this conflict of what's the IRC, Internal Revenue Code, which says that anyone who is a citizen or permanent resident is subjected to worldwide taxation on global assets. Well, you have to amend the tax code as well. So you've got these two sort of competing priorities where you need to amend the immigration legislation and you need to amend the tax code. Neither of those issues have been put forward, and yet you still see them bloviating about how great this program is. Howard Lutnick, who's the Secretary of Commerce, basically his department has been charged with sort of promoting this, and he's been on podcasts. The All In podcast is one example where, he said, I sold 1,000 of them last night. Sold them to who? Like, that's absolutely impossible. And it's just the absurd posturing of the Trump administration. And I know I'm going off on a tangent, but let me just finish this. It's insane that they're selling this product. And it is a product. I mean, because citizenship or residency by investment is a product. There is a financial transaction and services that are rendered. The goods is receiving the citizenship or residency permit. And it's just under the current legislation, this cannot happen. And I just I don't live in the US, so it doesn't really affect me, but I still, being brought up in the US, it definitely is strange to sort of look at it as an outsider, not living in the country and going, how is this going to play out? And especially being in the citizenship by investment world, it's very strange, sort of how the US is sort of moving in this direction, but then on the flip side is wagging its finger at other small Caribbean countries that basically make most of their money off tourism and providing financial services. Like, how dare you? How dare you sell your citizenship? But hey, if you guys want to come and buy ours, totally cool, even though it can't exist under US law. So anyways, that's my whole tangent. Sorry about that.
No worries. Am I noticing a loophole there? Which is, so I have a couple of friends who live and work in London. They're US citizens. And they've often explained to me about the global taxation, that even if they put money into an ISA here, so an individual savings account, which is a tax wrapper free from capital gains, they still have to pay capital gains on that growth to the US. Same in pension. So they don't benefit from the tax wrapping that we get, and they have to pay tax on everything, right? Their income, their blah, blah. So what would stop them if they had $5 million from rescinding their, because I've asked, what if you just take British citizenship? And they were like, oh, you can't take citizenship elsewhere. You have to then rescind your US passport. So it's basically binary. You're either American or you're not, is what they told me.
That's categorically incorrect. Both the UK and US allow for dual citizenship. I don't know about the UK, but sorry, go ahead.
If you are a dual citizen, so what you can't do is take British citizenship and then not pay US tax. So if you are a US citizen, you pay US tax globally, right?
Well, the best example of this is Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is what's known as an accidental American. Boris Johnson was born in New York City, lived there till he was about 5, and then moved back to Blighty. Right. Okay. There was a whole case. I don't know if you remember, but it was at least in the US news where he was either right before he became PM or during his time. He sold a property for about £600,000. And I know in the UK that your primary residence is completely exempt from income tax. The US, there's a limit. It's 250,000 US. If you're single, if you're married, it's 500,000 of capital gains. That's basically the allowance you're given. Anything over that, you're subject to capital gains. Basically, though, is that the IRS came knocking and they're like, Mr. Johnson, we know you're a world leader, but you have this giant tax bill. And he basically, was like, yeah, I'm not paying that. And what did he do? He ended up settling, paid the IRS, and then renounced US citizenship, which he should have done many, many years ago.
Yeah.
Right. But, this is a perfect example of what we're talking about.
So could someone living, let's say they've lived in the UK for 10 years, they're rich, could they not just renounce their US citizenship, right? Then buy the new citizenship for $5 million, which then exempts them from their global tax. So they're basically not an American citizen for a month. Then they're back to being an American citizen, except this time they don't pay global tax.
Yeah, so the issue is that the US has an exit tax. The UK does not. So basically, and And there's three caveats. Basically, you have to be compliant on your taxes, meaning you have to have filed your tax returns for the last 5 years. If you've paid more than a certain benchmark number in tax for those 5 years, or there's one other category I'm forgetting, but basically it's what they call a covered expatriate. And basically, you're either a covered expatriate or you're not. Basically, the cutoff is, or if your net worth is less than 2 million US. And so basically, the way the exit tax works is that they will do an assessment of the day of renunciation, your net worth, and they will put on paper, you sell everything. Now, there's an allowance of, I believe, 750,000 or 800,000 US that is given as an allowance to cover any capital gains tax you have. Anything over that threshold, if you're over the 2 million net worth, if you haven't paid taxes, or if you've paid over a certain amount of federal tax every year for the last 5 years, those are the conditions to make you a covered person. Famously, Edward Saverin, one of the co-founders of Facebook, originally born in Brazil, moved to the US, naturalized. Once the IPO for Facebook kicked off, he actually became a Singaporean citizen and renounced US citizenship. And people who are not natural born citizens in the US are not subject to the exit tax.
Wow, smart guy.
But we could do a whole other episode about US tax, but that's not my area of expertise. I'm just speaking as to my knowledge of what US tax code is about these issues. Let's circle back a little bit about the Bitcoin IFA. So I know you had said that you've been selling some of these sessions. What is the sort of short-term and long-term goal? So next 6 months, and let's say next 2 years, what are you really looking to do with this product?
It's a great question. So I've built this workshop, it's had almost universal and unilateral 5-star reviews. I think it's had 1 4-star review out of dozens. So, without trying to say it with some humility, it's a good session to basically take financial advisors from zero knowledge to about 80% there, right? I've applied the Pareto rule. They don't need to go deep on this, but they need to be able to speak confidently, clearly about what Bitcoin is, how it works, and what it can do for their client's portfolio. And that's what I've done.
So, for example, if you were to ask them about, say, like the block size wars back in 2017, they don't necessarily, need to be a big blocker or a small blocker and to get sort of that deep on sort of the evolutionary history of Bitcoin. They just need to know, from a high level viewpoint, I'm assuming, right?
Absolutely. So they although ironically, actually, I delivered a workshop recently and someone asked me, why can't it just be copied? And, I had to say, it can, and it has, it's completely open source code. You can launch Bitcoin 2.0, 3.0 tomorrow. The thing you're lacking is the network effect and human consensus that this is the Bitcoin network, right? So, and actually that made me think, it might be worth building a slide on the block wars to counter, because a good chunk of the workshop is essentially slides covering off FUD. So it's like, it's bad for the environment, it's too volatile, it's threatened by quantum computing, it's only used by criminals, blah, 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 right? Because these are all headlines that financial advisors are going to have seen. So I want to address those, right? So actually, I'm going to build another one which covers the block wars, which covers the, can it just be copied? Or either can it be copied, or can we just, what if someone forks off because there is decentralization? What if 10% say we're doing something else? And so I can explain. This has happened before. So it's something I might touch on in future. I haven't today. What is a blockchain and how does the blockchain work is one slide. What is decentralization is one slide. So it's very high level, gets them from zero knowledge to, the most informed person in the room, which is what they will be when they're speaking to their clients. Because if their client is more informed on them on Bitcoin after going through my presentation, they're probably not a client of a financial advisor. They're probably just doing Bitcoin on their own. So I've built this thing, right? But this product is really a one-time thing. It's a fire and forget, right? Because I deliver the workshop or the webinar and I give them the PDF. And the PDF is enough for them to be able to refer back to, right? So when a client asks them a question they don't know, they should be able to say, don't know, let me get back to you. Go to the PDF and be like, there's the answer. So it's good for the next 6 to 12 months, right? The TAM, the total addressable market of the UK, is about 30,000 advisors with probably somewhere between 2 and 3 support staff for each advisor. So what we call power planner and then admins. Sometimes they have different names, but you typically have advisor, power planner, admin, right? So there's actually 3 people per client, not just the advisor. So realistically, the TAM is 90 to 100,000 maybe, right? But at least 50% of them are tied or restricted. Realistically, it's probably somewhere between sort of 30 to 50,000 people that I can deliver this to.
That's a very sizable market, though.
It's not bad, right? And so if I can get 10 to 20% of that, that's more than enough to carry me forwards for the next few years, right? So, but what it doesn't generate is obviously any ARR. So it's purely a one-time thing, one-time sell. But then where I'm going with this is I need to transition everything to a single platform. Right now, I've built a quite disparate tech stack. So I'm probably going to end up working with like an all-in-one platform where I can deliver workshops, webinars, one-to-one coaching, but also a community. So where I think I'm going to go with this is have a community, get that up and running, get a good few hundred people in there, all asking questions of each other. Like, how do I talk to a client about this, about Bitcoin, and blah, 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 what percentage should I allocate? All that stuff. And then what I'll do is launch ancillary products on top of that. So on top of the community, hopefully I'll launch something like, if you pay whatever per month, you'll get all of the current functionality, but you will also get, maybe I do 2 calls a week with me, right? So 10 people for a 1-hour call twice a week with me, and that will get recorded and put out to them. So it's, if you have a specific question, come on the call with me. But if not, just watch the call back, because it's going to be answering financial advice, client specific questions about Bitcoin. Plus maybe, I have a newsletter at the moment, so I'll probably do, add something on top of that goes behind a paywall. At the moment, I release 2 podcasts a month. I'll probably maybe do a third and put that behind a paywall, or a fourth, do 1 a week and put 50% of them behind a paywall. So ultimately what I want to do is build this community that's behind a paywall, 20, 30 pounds a month, and you get all of the free stuff and all of the ancillary stuff. That's where I'd like to get to, right? Because at the moment, it's hard work trying to sell this thing that I can only sell once. So ultimately, obviously, I want to have recurring revenue just like everyone else. That's the ultimate goal of any business, right? So some kind of subscription model with premium content that's behind a paywall, and then we'll see. We'll see what the market wants to give. I'm open to almost anything, and collaboration within the Bitcoin community. An idea that literally came to me a couple of weeks ago is, well, I've now got 15 financial advisors in a WhatsApp group. What if we just set up a financial advice firm with Bitcoin as the focus?
That's perhaps one angle. One thing I was going to hit on, and I would encourage all the listeners, and Dan yourself, if you haven't heard of this, but there's this really old, I want to say it's maybe even 15 years old, something like that, but it's a blog post that I remember reading, and it talks about having 1,000 diehard fans. Okay, you're nodding. You might have heard of this, but basically the concept is that, look, if you are anyone in some kind of public position, or I guess what the modern term would be, influencer, right? You have some social media presence. If you have 1,000 diehard followers and are able to monetize only 1,000 of them for $100 each, you can generate 100,000 US per year. And this was sort of the number, I would say post-inflation or post-COVID with inflation, that number is probably closer to 150,000 US to live comfortably, but it's this idea that, monetizing $100 out of someone over the course of a year with perhaps a few small purchases or even one purchase, $100, let's call it the 65 pounds, right? Not a lot. And if you can do that on a small scale, it's definitely possible to live and not have to work for someone else, to be your own boss if you can get to that level, which is very obtainable. So, Dan, are you familiar with this concept?
Yeah, I've never actually read the blog post. People have told me about it. So yeah, I've heard it described as 1,000 true fans.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
um,
Exactly.
and do you know what? Like, yeah, that's been in the back of my mind from day one, which is I need 1,000 people paying for the community X amount a month, whatever that looks like, or an officer obviously offer some kind of annual discount. But yeah, if you've got 1,000 true fans and you produce content to retain them, valuable content to retain them year in, year out, that's the ultimate goal. And I'm also front weighting the work. So I'm probably doing 60 to 80-hour weeks at the moment. I've taken 3 full days off in the last 5 months. That's it. And I'm okay with that because building something requires a period of being unbalanced, because ultimately where I want to get to is a year from now, 2 years from now, I have 1,000 true fans paying me X pounds a month, and I can produce really, really good quality content that they want and need for their clients for 20 hours a month, 30 hours a month. Then why wouldn't I? So, ultimately, let's say I do this business for 10 years, I'm probably going to end up putting in the same amount of hours that someone who does 40 hours a week at their job does. It's just, I'm just front weighting them now so that in my mid to late 40s, I can do 20 to 40 hours a month rather than 80 hours a week.
There's definitely some value in that. I think my biggest thing was once I left working for the government and I was like, I need to work weekends. And doing something like that is a completely different mindset. But once that switch gets flipped, you're like, okay, once you're working for yourself and you're obligated to yourself, you paint yourself into this corner and okay, now I have to succeed because if I don't, it's maybe moving back into mom's spare bedroom or that kind of thing. And I actually did that during COVID. I quit one government job and was out of work for 10 months during COVID and then got another government job. But I moved back in with my mom at the age of 41 during COVID. And, I was there for 3 months. And then I had a house that I had purchased about 5 years before, and renters moved out of it. So I just moved back into the home that I had already purchased and planned on that. But, a lot of things happened during COVID. So I never thought at, early 40s, I would move in with my mom again, left home at 18. But it happens and you do what you have to do. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing something like that. Maybe the stigma is a little less during COVID because the world went sideways for a few years. But once you start becoming your own boss and becoming accountable to yourself, you have to be willing to put in the hours. So I can definitely sort of commiserate with you, sort of on a mutual suffering level where you're just constantly putting in hours and you're like, I don't know if this will work, but you're just kind of rolling the dice. I do just want to kind of be mindful of time. So I just wanted to close this up. We haven't really talked anything philosophical about Bitcoin. We've been talking a lot of financial talk, and that's definitely not my area of expertise. So I appreciate you sort of indulging me with explain this to me like I'm 5 years old, that sort of things. That's very helpful. Just wanted to get your general philosophical thoughts about Bitcoin. There's always this constant idea. Is it a store of value? Is it a just payment network? Or I think it can be all of these things. But I'm just curious what, from a high level view, what do you see as sort of the primary use of Bitcoin if you want to look at it as a Bitcoiner, as a financial advisor? Take your position, and if you could just share with the listeners your philosophical take on Bitcoin.
Sure. Philosophically, Bitcoin is freedom money, and ultimately it's a payment network. It's a peer-to-peer anonymous unit of exchange in the long term. Right? So 50 to 100 years from now, maybe. It is also a store of value. Right now, it's a very speculative is probably not the word, but it's the best performing store of value because we are denominating Bitcoin in fiat currency. And that's why it is so valuable. And that you'll know this in the Bitcoin community, we say 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin. Who cares what the price is in dollars, Swiss francs, blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, that's not the world that we live in yet. So 1 Bitcoin does equal 1 Bitcoin, but 1 Bitcoin also equals the value that we are prepared to place on it from a dollar standpoint, a pound standpoint, Swiss franc, etc. I suppose is my long-winded way of saying both.
We talked off air about this, but we both got into Bitcoin at the same time in December 2020. I was actually looking, this was in the last week, I was looking at some of my Coinbase purchases. I had thought I knew how much Bitcoin was trading for. I actually did a post on LinkedIn the other day where it was, I think, it was June 28th. Bitcoin was trading 5 years ago, June 28th, 2020, for $9,048.
Wow.
And that day, so today is July 1st. So 3 days ago, it was 106,000 something. I don't remember the exact number, but you've got this thing that went for just a sliver. It's less than 10K. So, let's call it 6750 in pounds, right? Somewhere around there. How much is it, going to be worth in 5 years? Like, this is the long-term question. It's not so much that is it a store of value, but it's also about the scarcity. I saw something the other day where 98% of all Bitcoin will be mined by 2030. 98%.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's 99 by 2034, I think.
Perhaps, yeah, I haven't seen it that far out. But then just because the way that the halving cycles are built in every 4 years, I mean, you think about in 2016, before the halving that year, the reward for mining 1 Bitcoin was 12.5. Started at 50, 25, 12.5, 6.25, and now we're at 3.125 as a block rewards.
And weekly demand is already far outstripping weekly new supply.
Oh, absolutely. I was speaking with someone just the other day that was talking about trying to purchase a large amount of Bitcoin. And I just said, the issue is liquidity. There is no liquidity on central exchanges. It does not exist. The amount it's not there. Like, you're talking a multi-year project. I know that Michael Saylor started with MicroStrategy, now known as Strategy, buying in August 2020. I think they're just under 600,000 Bitcoin on their balance sheet now.
I think they're just over, aren't they? So I thought they crossed. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's around that. Yeah.
But, the obvious next question is, okay, well, they're going to set their sights on 1 million because that's what Satoshi mined, right? So that's what's in Satoshi's wallet. How long does it take them to get to 1 million Bitcoin? And that's really, at least as a Bitcoiner, that's sort of like at the back of my mind. And I have other, issues about, I really don't know how much of that is paper Bitcoin. They've been very, very squeamy and squirrelish about allowing outside auditors to actually come in and see how much because there's only so much debt you can leverage. If there's, what's the financial term? Like, is it a market call? Is that it? Or a call option? Is that the correct term?
Yeah, if you get margin called.
Margin called. Okay, thank you. And people call on that debt because they're just issuing more debt to buy Bitcoin. It's not that they have all this profit. It's they're taking on a ton of debt, turning around, taking that cash and buying Bitcoin. And then saying, hey, look at all this we have. Well, yeah, but how much money do you owe to the shareholders? And there was a stock division. I believe they issued like a different stock for this or that. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure or that knowledgeable about the intricacies of that specific case, but that's just what I remember reading. And there is kind of that question, like, I don't know, how long can you accumulate that much debt, carry that leverage before people go, you know what, I'm done. It's only until, like, as you said, it's difficult until it's not, right? So until people will continue to give them their money. And let's also remember that there was a day where Michael Saylor in 2013 lost over $1 billion US. You can famously find this. Yeah.
How?
There was if I'm
Was it
correct,
Argentina?
yes, you were talking about, hyperinflation. Argentina historically has had problems with the devaluation of their peso, and he had put a bunch of money, and the exchange rate shifted, and he lost over $1 billion back in 2013. This guy is not infallible. So what do they always say? Never meet your idols.
Yeah, true. But then, I also like Charlie Munger's quote, which is show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. So he has the incentive, having lost a bunch of money, he has the incentive to try and protect his existing money, if that makes sense. So, I think he's made a lot of money predicting the next step in technology. Right. So I actually touch on this in my workshops, which is, just be careful who you get your information from, because Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger thought Bitcoin is rat poison. Bill Gates famously says he'll never touch Bitcoin. But these guys also are very, very good at what they do. But what they do is probably 20th century stuff. So, Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, probably the single greatest 20th century investors to have ever existed, did really well in tangible things that they can touch and hold, Coca-Cola, Walmart, Costco. But Warren Buffett very famously missed Google's and Amazon's IPO, and Google he should have really seen, because Geico Insurance is owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And at the time of Google's IPO, the largest single advertising line item for Geico was Google. So he should have seen, if he was in his business, he should have seen that our single largest advertising spend is with this company and they're IPOing. There is this new abstract technology that we probably need to be on. So he has found it very difficult to predict the next stage of technology and benefit from it for himself and his shareholders. Bill Gates very famously said the internet is a passing fad. The CEO of Microsoft thought that the internet, he said the internet, we're not interested in it. So just be careful where you get your information. Whereas someone like Michael Saylor, he wrote a book in 2010 and 2011, which was released in 2012, called The Mobile Wave. And he predicted just how profound, both positively and negatively, mobiles, cell phones are going to impact our lives. And I distinctly remember being sat in strategy meetings with BT. So BT are British Telecom, so like the US equivalent of like Verizon or AT&T. They are a top 3 advertiser in the UK, certainly were back then, probably the largest digital advertiser, very progressive, very forward thinking. And we were sat in strategy meetings with them in 2010 and 2011, desperately trying to convince them to just invest a small amount of money into their mobile site. Just be like, look, people are browsing on mobile now. They really are. They're doing their research, and they just couldn't get their heads around it. And I was like, this is a progressive advertiser who I generally want to be right at the forefront, right at the coalface of new tech, new advertising tech. And they couldn't see it back then. Michael Saylor wrote a book saying, this is going to be this profound. So I don't want to evangelize the guy. He's going to be fallible. He is a human, but and that's the thing. Bitcoin is only fallible because of the humans, right? The protocol itself is clean. It's the humans in charge. And it's the same argument I use for someone recently was trying to tell me why they're investing in XRP. And I was like, look, just focus on Bitcoin, comparatively Bitcoin, 80, 90%. The rest, have fun, go nuts. But it's a casino, and assume that it's going to zero. And they sent me this video about XRP. It's going to $500. It's going to form part of the underlying CBDC technology. And I was like, look, maybe, but it's And they were like, and it's finite. There's only ever going to be 1 billion and they're burning them. And I was like, okay, let's say XRP does go to $500 a coin. It's currently $2. So that's, whatever, 150x. Let's say it does. What is to stop the humans in charge from just going, why don't we just release just 1 million more? Just 1 million more. It's barely going to touch the sides. 1 billion and 1 million coins because it's worth $500 a coin. So, that's $500 million that we can just create and dump on retail. It's the humans that are the fallible point. So the Bitcoin network itself. And so bring this back to Michael Saylor, you're absolutely correct. Like no one really knows. And I think the litmus test is obviously going to be the next bear market, and there will be one, to see, how far down, what is the drawdown that Bitcoin goes through? Does MicroStrategy survive? And I think if MicroStrategy survives another 80% drawdown, then we know it's legit. But it's whether that margin call can survive another 80% drawdown. I would assume that Michael Saylor knows what he's doing, and he's built that in, he's factored it in. What if we get an 80% drawdown from here? What if it drops to 20? What if we get an 80% drawdown from 200, 300, 500, whatever?
If you actually just look, I was actually looking at this the other day, looking at the historical prices. Like I was saying, I was looking at 5 years. I was looking at what Bitcoin was worth like around Christmas time in 2023. It was down to $25,000. I mean, this is less than 24 months ago. So we've got a 4x in the last 24 months. Like, I understand that, we kind of keep hitting the ceiling of what's all-time high, 111,000 US, I think. It kind of keeps hitting that. We're around 107,000 US today. I don't know. We might see 175,000 this run. I definitely think it's going to keep going into 2026. But you're absolutely right. At some point, there will be a drawdown, and it's cyclical. It happens. So it's really knowing when to take profit and when to get off the roller coaster. At least I think.
No one ever went broke taking profit.
Very true. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Dan, I really just want to say thank you very much for your time, your generosity, explaining everything to the listeners, explaining how some of the UK financial markets work. I didn't know that much coming in. Still probably don't know that much, should know more, but definitely feel educated and feel like I'm walking away with at least enough to maybe throw my 2 cents in on a conversation. So definitely appreciate that. Definitely appreciate your thoughts on Bitcoin. And it's always great to have another Bitcoiner on the show and discuss philosophy and finances and everything surrounding Bitcoin. So where can people find you? Please, plug where they can find more information about the Bitcoin IFA.
Sure. Well, firstly, to say it's been a pleasure to be on. Thank you for inviting me on, and thank you for all your help and support, especially on LinkedIn, Adam. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you. For the listeners, you can find me on X at the Bitcoin IFA. You can go to thebitcoinifa.com. Feel free to purchase the webinars. And you can find me on LinkedIn, Daniel Parkinson. And you can find the Bitcoin IFA page on LinkedIn as well. So pretty much all across those, wherever you want to follow, you'll stay up to date.
And I believe the sessions, the price for the sessions are going up soon. So for all the listeners, please get in, buy those now before prices go up. I know they are going up very soon, and space is limited. So go support Dan.
Thank you. We actually increased prices today. So the webinar prices are now up. So we're on the 3rd round pre-launch, because there's been pretty good demand. So this is the last opportunity to buy those at a discount from launch price.
Absolutely. All right. So you guys know where to go to get it. Again, Dan, it's been a pleasure. So this has been Bitcoin Lawyer with Dan Parkinson. And if it's not BTC, you're SOL. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin Lawyer podcast. For more information, please visit our website at www.bitcoinlawyer.com. And remember, Bitcoin Lawyer is your legal bridge between Bitcoin and freedom.